You like, thank you. All right, so I'm going to start by sharing the screen. Uh, so, so as you can see on the screen, this course is called Karma and Emptiness. And hopefully all of you could see my screen, can you?
Yep, we can see it clearly, thank you.
Thank you. Um, and so this is a course that will be, this being the first session, there'll be four sessions over the next um, 4 Tuesdays. So for the 4 Tuesdays in the month of February. So just so you know, most of you know me, but I want you to know as I present this subject, I'm presenting. Um, you could say I'm teaching, but I'm really presenting the teachings that you see listed here on the screen. And it's important to keep that in mind. Um, and these are really core texts that have been created over centuries, going back to the Buddha and then the lineage of the masters who are masters of this topic. The Buddha, of course, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Jason Kappa. Mainly, you'll see me referring to these teachers, these masters during the course of this presentation. And I'll do my best to do that faithfully and accurately. But anything that I might not accurately represent then would be totally my fault and not any of these masters. So something to keep in mind. I'll do my best, of course. And then also listed here the specific meditation practices that this presentation and over the next 4 weeks is based on and will be utilized to a certain degree in actual discussion, but then also as we have time to do actual meditations, we'll try to do one or more of these. So here we're talking about Chandrakirti's sevenfold reasoning meditation on emptiness. Then we're talking about Nagarjuna's four-point reasoning, which is a distillation of Chandrakirti's seven-point reasoning. Diamond slivers is usually used in connection with refuting inherent existence connected to phenomena. And then parenthetically there, I show where that particular meditation practice originated from. And then what is often called the monarch of reasonings, reasonings meaning meditative analysis that analyzes the ultimate nature of things. Nagarjuna's dependent arising meditation. So just sort of keep this in mind. Then also know that everything you'll see on the screen tonight, I will make available through the chat as an attachment to everyone for purposes of you having this information handy. So you can take notes maybe based on some of what I articulate in addition to what you are going to see on the screen. But so you know, you don't have to be writing all these down. I think that's important. So this topic tonight is called karma and emptiness. And what we're going to try to put into focus is what are they and how are they, meaning karma and emptiness, actually connected? And most important for any of us, why does this matter? Some of us have been Buddhist practitioners for some time and have maybe very good understanding of how they're connected and why it matters. But for the purposes of this course, I cannot proceed into the deeper waters of what we'll be presenting without framing out these essentials. And all of us can benefit by revisiting, in some cases, for some of us, that framing out, and for others, maybe hearing it for the first time. So this will be one of the main focuses of tonight. And then, most important, how can knowledge and realizations of these two topics be helpful and applicable in improving our lives, especially lessening and then actually eliminating our experience of suffering? So it's a pretty serious topic. Um, it could get heady at times, or some would say academic. But by framing out what I'm going to frame out through the bulk of this evening's presentation, hopefully it will bring it a little closer to home in the sense of having a sense of connectivity to it in terms of the uh, third bullet point there. So, doing the framing out, we cannot we cannot explore this topic without first having in focus in our minds what we're attempting to actually deal with here. What we're attempting to deal with here is the nature of reality. The nature of reality, from a Buddhist point of view, is to be found in the Four Noble Truths. So they teach us, as it says on the screen, that life involves dissatisfaction caused by craving or grasping, which can be ended. And that's embedded within the Four Noble Truths themselves. So when we look at the Four Noble Truths, we need to keep in our mind throughout this presentation of what we're doing over these 4 weeks, what the Four Noble Truths are. Truth of suffering, life involves suffering, dissatisfaction, unease, including actual birth, aging, sickness, death, and in the Buddhist cosmology, rebirth, cyclic suffering existence. And then the truth of the cause of suffering is the second truth. Suffering is caused by craving, desire, and attachment to all things rooted in ignorance. That's the most important thing to remember relative to our what we're going to be exploring throughout this course. Suffering is caused by craving by who? By sentient beings, by us, by all sentient beings. And then the truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the statement within the Four Noble Truths that it's possible to actually end suffering by eliminating this craving and attachment or grasping. And then the fourth noble truth is that there's a path to actually end it. If there's a way to end it, which is the third noble truth, if it could be ended, I should say, then there's a way to end it. And that's what Buddhist teachings are, and especially what we are going to delve into tonight, which is doing a review of this sort of framing out of how the Four Noble Truths actually come about. So these truths act, as I put here in a bulleted list, as what I call a diagnostic framework. What do I mean by that? It means that as we look at life and its nature being suffering, and how we could possibly end it, what could be the path of cessation, what we learn in the teachings that follow forth from the Four Noble Truths is that it provides the entire Buddhist um, uh, landscape of teachings is a diagnostic um, is the prescription to this framework of how things actually exist, which is presented in the Four Noble Truths. And then we're treating suffering as a disease, meaning that as we think of a disease in a normal way, we can treat it and it can be cured. So it starts by identifying its cause, and that's what we're going to really focus on tonight, connecting it directly to karma and emptiness, and then confirming that a cure actually does exist, which relates to the fourth noble truth directly. And then the prescribing of the actual medicine, which is the fourth noble truth, which is the path, as I put there in parentheses. So try to keep, most of us are familiar with all this, so I'm not spending a lot of time on it. but we do need to keep this fundamentally at the foundation of what we are delving into here, what we're attempting to deal with. This has to start in terms of how we understand the path, that fourth noble truth, with understanding the wheel of life. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but we do need to make this part of our framework of reference or understanding. So, the wheel of life is the Buddha's teaching on suffering existence, and it is a way to see in a iconic, symbolic depiction the entire realm of existence and what is operating within the realm of existence, what energy, where does it come from, where does it go? If it does create suffering, how do we tackle that? How do we understand that? How can we end that? So, everything I'm going to present over the next 3 or 4 pages is related to what we can see here on the screen as being a series of circles in which within each one of them there is a key to unlock in terms of understanding how suffering arises, where it comes from, and how we can tackle um, ending it. So the first its parts, is that series of circles. As I said, there's 4 of them, and each of these energetically feed the next. And when I use the word energetically, I'm not using it poetically or metaphorically. It is literally energy that um, gives um, arising experience what it needs to actually arise. So it's kind of important to think of it that way. Um, so starting at the center, the first innermost circle is what is called the 3 poisons. This has a direct connection to the first of the 12 links of dependent origination. How that's directly linked to it, which we'll get to in a minute, is that it is ignorance. It's the first of the 3 poisons listed here. So the 3 poisons are in the very center because that is the energy that takes place through the sense consciousnesses and our mental consciousness as we are, in a mistaken, uninformed way, experiencing everything that arises. And we either have a grasping onto, attachment to it, or an aversion to it in a mistaken way. And that's what we have to keep in mind. That's why they're called poisons, because they're the very core of what creates the presence of suffering in our mind stream. That leads to the second circle, the circle of non-virtuous and virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind. Those you can see in the circle that surrounds the 3 poison circle. There's these depiction of beings moving downward, chained at each end, at the feet and at the arms. This represents non-virtuous activity. So, coming from the energy of dependent arising experience, every single dependent arising experience that happens from within the context of the 3 poisons, then manifests through us indulging in non-virtuous activity or virtuous activity, which is depicted on the other side, a lighter background. And you can see that all the beings here are moving upward because they're practicing of doing activities of body, speech, and mind that are virtuous. And just as a reminder to what those are, we'll switch screens here to look just quickly at what are called the 10 non-virtuous deeds. These 10 non-virtuous deeds are of 3 types. Again, body, speech, and mind. We should all be familiar with these. But these are energetically what manifests in our mind, uh, and then manifests further in our moment by moment experience. When we have the three poisons present constantly in our mind stream. So the opposite of this, again, associated with the other half of that circle, are what are the 10 virtuous deeds of body, speech, and mind. So we should all be familiar with these. We won't spend time going through them. But we need to keep these in mind. We need to know them. We need to know that what the energy is that is emanating from the four circles that make up the Wheel of Life. Wheel of Life also is not poetic. It's literally a diagram of like what takes place in the entire realm of existence. So then it's to be taken seriously. If you're not familiar with the Wheel of Life, then you should spend some time delving deeper into it. The next two circles, the third circle and the fourth circle, depicted here, it's hard to see. I apologize. I'll talk through it, but it's kind of meant to be mm, just so you can have a snapshot of it. But the third circle is what manifests through ignorance, spurring on, grasping, and aversion that take place in the center. And then, of course, what's not shown here is the second non-virtuous, virtuous energy that we create. And then from there, we have the third circle, which are the realms of existence that we actually manifest in. They are the six realms of samsara or suffering existence. And then the fourth circle, and those six realms are the human realm, um, the animal realm, what's called the craving realm, what's called the realms of agony, the realms of heaven. So three of these, and then also the realm of conflict. So the three above the midpoint line are considered higher realms. That includes the human realm of the six, and then the three below that, the realms of craving, agony, animals, are considered lower realms. Most of you would know this. But what we're really going to focus on tonight are the first two links of the 12 links of dependent origination, which are depicted on the outer circle. And they start with an image that we'll see in a moment of a blind person walking. And then the next second activity is what's called karmic activity or karmic formations or action. And that's represented by a person sitting and a potter actually shaping a pot, or here it says shaping a vessel. And that's where karmic formations occur. So right away, in the first two of the 12 links of dependent origination, we have the presence of the opposite of emptiness, which is ignorance, specifically the wisdom of emptiness, which is knowledge, which is more specifically, more precisely the opposite of ignorance. And we'll talk more about that in a few moments. And then we have karma. One leads to the other. And then from there, the entire realm of and the energy that's involved of existence for every sentient being and for all phenomena manifests. And we're not going to go through them in detail. Again, we're going to focus tonight on the first two, but it's important to know that from karma, we have the movement of the mind in terms of conceptual thinking is the words that are used here. And then most important, when we talk about the mistaken um, labeling that we do with our minds constantly, that movement of the mind, we create words and images. that are misconceptions of how things really are. Something that we'll grapple with in the upcoming sessions of this course, understanding what that really means. That leads to sense perception. And then sense perception leads to contact. And that's where attraction actually occurs. And then the next one here, it's called judgment or fixation. And that's depicted by an arrow piercing an eye because that contact and that attraction causes pain in many of our daily experiences in the human realm and in all the realms. And then that leads to a further thirsting for desiring that those attractive things that we feel have some inherent quality that if only I could possess it, then this will make me happy. And then that leads to intense clinging, having desire. That's represented by a man picking fruit. It leads to the most intimate of symbolic energies. It goes beyond symbolic energies, the energy that actually creates in the human realm for us who are looking at this from that point of view, and all of us are, then sexual intercourse, where conception occurs. Then birth follows that. Then birthing is creation, and then the process of living, and then sickness, dying, and then finally what's called release or death. And then that cycle continues unless it's broken. And that's part of what we're going to learn tonight and over the course of this, all these sessions, is how that is possible to break it. By breaking it, we end suffering. We end suffering existence. So this is part of what we're going to look to experience. So just looking back one more time at the entire wheel of life, we can see there's other aspects to it. There's the actual monster who is holding the wheel. That's Yama. Yama is the Lord of Death. But Yama is enlightened here. It has the crown of the five skulls representing the purified form of the five Buddha families, um, which are the purified forms of something that we work with when we do emptiness meditation. We'll get to that. So this is all very purposeful. So it's an interesting question, like why is Yama holding suffering existence so tightly, keeping us within it if he's enlightened? Not going to answer that question, but it's something for us to grapple with and think about. And then, of course, there's other elements here, the moon with the rabbit, then the sun. There's a practitioner in the clouds. So these all have meaning, but we're not going to talk about them tonight. We're not going to focus on them tonight. So, but know that everything is really important. Nothing is gratuitous or just for decorative purposes. That's always the case in Buddhist iconography. So, as I said, we're going to focus on the first two links here. Uh, Ignorance is the first link, and seeing it in a pictorial form, we could see, hopefully, you could see here that what ignorance means is a lack, I have parenthetically, lack of understanding the true nature of all things. That's the first link. And it's depicted by a blind man. He has a walking stick because he cannot see. So he's fumbling his way forward. And then this is symbolic of ignorance, which starts the whole process of suffering existence and puts it into motion. And motion occurs when there's movement of the mind um, in a way that is, it has as its core an ignorant, mistaken way of experiencing all dependent arisings that occur in that mind, which result in action. Action means like anything that moves in the mind and in the human realm through the vehicle of speech and the body. And these are and as these actions actually start, they're more precisely called karmic formations or activities. So we can see here, I made reference to this earlier, there's a potter. He's forming, he's representative of making the karmic formations through the activities that occur through the dependent arising manifestations that we experience all the time, every single moment, but unfortunately mistakenly, meaning through the lens of ignorance. We're like a blind man. So we'll talk a little bit further about these two in a focused way, and I'll try to connect them in a very direct and hopefully dynamic way that brings to life their connection to karma and emptiness. So we'll bring up this next this next slide, if you will. So during this lifetime and all lifetimes in Buddhist cosmology, we have been in existence as sentient beings since beginningless time. So then this lifetime is not the only lifetime we've been present in the realm of suffering existence, which we just went through. So we engage in all our actions of body, speech, and mind based on ignorance. That arises in connection to a constant stream of dependent arising interactions. And that this causes our mind to engage with all objects, inner and outer objects, and we either have attachment to them or we have aversion to them. And as we get familiar with this way of thinking and we're mindful of that kind of statement, we can prove that in our ordinary lives as we move forward moment by moment, if we're just turning our mind to have that kind of awareness. So this quote comes from Nagarjuna, and he says, wrapped in the darkness of ignorance, that's that first link, one performs the three kinds of actions, which as propensities or potentials impel one to continue to future existences. So here, Nagarjuna is talking about um, what is it that actually happens in the darkness of ignorance? We take and engage in the three kinds of actions. That's that actual process as we look at that wheel, the 12 links of dependent origination is the actual movement of our mind at every given moment and moves us right into that second link. Um, so here, when we look at that, we have to see that one is already caught in suffering existence for this one reason that Nagarjuna gives us, which is our engagement in acts or actions. And specifically, there are three types of actions that take place karmically in Buddhist action theory or Buddhist a belief system. And karma, by the way, is not um, unique to Buddhist thinking. It's present as a science uh, and a way of understanding how cause and effect are present in everything in non-Buddhist thinking as well. But here there are three general kinds of actions that distinguish Buddhist actions. And there's physical, verbal, and mental. And then these actions that we take, and you could think back to actions that are labeled in these diagrams as being the 10 either virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind, or non-virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind as being directly connected to these three general kinds of actions that occur either mentally, verbally, using speech, or physically. So when we engage in these actions, they plant within our mind stream the propensities or actions existing in a potential form. So when a karmic action is completed, it means that the potential for that action to manifest and ripen in the future has taken a form in what we would call its potential. And then when it's actually actualized, it emerges as a new action of body, speech, and mind in the same mind stream that created that potential, not in someone else's. And then this in turn leads to a variety of new consequences and to the continuation of that cycle that we were looking at earlier of samsaric existence. And then that is directly connected in a very direct way to the concept of transmigration, which is a continuation of suffering existence or samsara. So Nagarjuna is simply saying that this is a dependent arising schema of consequences of one's action. And then in that wheel of life, we could see that that is the next. I'm going back a few slides. I should have restated it actually, that that's what happens once karmic actions are completed. They create that potential for similar action in the future. And then that leads to consciousness in the sense of conceptually thinking about things in a certain way as they moment by moment manifest, meaning those karmic potentials as they start to manifest. So then this is something that we have to understand that that's how things work normally. So here we're going to just take a moment to review the rest of the 12 links and frame them out. We're not going to go into them in any kind of great detail. So on the screen here, you could see that the 12 links are called links, by the way, because they're connected together and they're unbreakable as long as we stay in a state of ignorance, which is represented by that blind man with the walking stick. The key to breaking the link so that suffering existence can possibly end is transforming ignorance into wisdom. And we'll talk about like what that kind of wisdom that actually is. Again, Nagarjuna will be giving us the key to that in a few moments. But here, I just want you to know that there's three, what are called the three thorough afflictions. I color coded them because it can get really complicated. But the first one's ignorance. It shows you again how important understanding the true nature of things, which is the actual antidote to ignorance is. And that's why we're going to be delving deeply into understanding emptiness in this course. But ignorance is put together with attachment and grasping, which come much later on. They're number 8 and 9 in the 12 links. But they're classified together as one of the thorough afflictions because ignorance directly leads to attachment and grasping. Again, that goes right back to the three poisons. Remember that. That's one of the reasons I expressly showed you the energy that is, where does it really come from? Why is that at the core of the wheel of life? So then this is showing you that there's this direct connection between that and the 12 links that are constantly manifesting for all sentient beings. And then the second thorough affliction is action. Action is actually karmic formations that we've already talked about, which is number two on the wheel. And that's directly connected to existence. That without um, having karmic formations occur, if somehow they didn't occur, then existence would not occur. That might sound nihilistic, but we're not talking about existence in the totality sense. We're talking about the mistaken way that we believe and experience and manifest existence, which is thinking everything has something that it doesn't, which is what we'll be talking about in a few moments. It's very important and unlocks the key. So sometimes the way things are worded in things like this diagram could make one go, "Oh, geez, I don't want nothing to do with that." But that's not what it's saying here. So I'm proactively saying, don't equate action creating existence with if that wasn't there, then nothing would actually be. That's nihilism. So we'll come back to that over and over during these sessions because it's very important not to allow ourselves to go there. And then the third thorough affliction is the actual production of suffering. This is where, if you went under the hood, which we won't do tonight, but you could see how it happens, is that actions have the effect in one's consciousness, not just your mental consciousness, but through your sense consciousnesses. In Buddhism, each one of our senses has a sense consciousness that we could experience uh, dependently arising in connection with both our inner self and all outer manifestations, including other sentient beings, which are considered part of phenomena. So that's what all of these articulate. You could see that number eight and nine are also part of this because you don't skip over them in the production process of what you can clearly see happens here. From these consciousnesses, name and form take shape, senses take shape, then contact, then feelings, then attachment, grasping, existence, birth, aging, death, and then the cycle repeats. So, what I've done here for the first half hour of our presentation is to give you the framework, the foundation that you must keep in mind because you have to know what you're working with when you're talking about karma and emptiness in a Buddhist cosmology context. Like, why are we even talking about it? It can become an academic exercise. It isn't. It's about life and death. And I mean in the sense that goes beyond this limited life that we're currently living. So it's deadly important, seriously important, but um, you could only really see that clearly if you keep the framework in mind. We're talking about the Four Noble Truths. We're talking about the representation of the manifestation of the Four Noble Truths, especially the Noble Truths of suffering and the cause of suffering being present for you to see clearly in the 12 links of dependent origination and the rest of the wheel of life, then you need to sort of keep these in mind when you are engaging in the topic that is um, the main bout, as they say in boxing, for the rest of what we're talking about through this series. So now we go back to Nagarjuna, and he says that these three pathways that we just talked about, those three groups, mutually cause one another. He says that they appear like a whirling of a firebrand. So the actual quote is with these three pathways mutually causing each other without a beginning, without a middle, or an end, the wheel of cyclic existence turns like a wheel of a firebrand. So when we consider, when we really allow ourselves to see the full scope of the wheel of life and what's implicated and clearly actually stated through its symbolic representation of these four wheels, we could see how it is the cause of suffering or cyclic existence, and that it just keeps turning. And what he means by saying it doesn't have a beginning, a middle, or an end means that it's endless. It's always existence. It's beginningless time and continues. Um, and you can't identify where it starts, where there's a middle, and where there's an end. You can look at the 12 links of dependent origination and create that linear connection, but that's not what he's talking about here. So continue here with the next quote. So this is Nagarjuna talking specifically in his text called the Treatise to the Middle Way, which is one of the texts that we're utilizing in this course. He says the root of cyclic suffering, the bracketed text is mine. So it just clarifies that we're talking about suffering existence is action. Again, I say in brackets, karmic formations. I have that as a not a bracket. Let me change that. So here we go. Therefore, the wise one does not act. And then, therefore, the unwise is the agent. The wise one is not, I parenthetically or bracketedly, the agent because of his insight. So, what is he talking about here? So, as we just talked about what we could see in the Wheel of Life, and more specifically, the 12 links of dependent origination, we could see that that first line we could see. Maybe not too clearly if we're not familiar with the 12 links of dependent origination or karma or karmic formations as it's present there as a second link. But I've said enough that you could see what he's talking about. That the root of suffering existence is karmic formations, is action. So, but he says, therefore, the wise, the wise one, does not act. So, what does he mean by not act? How could you not act? How do we live without acting? Again, remember, acting, taking action is all that we do with our body, speech, and mind. We've already identified that earlier. So, what does it really mean? Does it really mean not to act, not to allow for any action? Um, so, Nagarjuna here seems to be saying that. Um, and if you do act, then you're being unwise. He says that's what he means by agent. You're creating karmic formations and you're unwise and you're the agent of those karmic formations through taking action. So he seems though to give us the answer, and then of course he stands back and goes, um, and says if you're wise, then you're not causing any, you're not the cause of karmic formations. But the most important thing he says is what? Because of his insight. So what's he talking about? Insight is incredibly, incredibly important here. So here we have to understand what Nagarjuna means by the word actions. Step back for a minute. In Buddhist philosophy and theory and cosmology, context is everything. As a matter of fact, the same words in one context versus another can mean something completely different. So here, though, this context, he's talking about the constant mistaken identity of all things as having inherent existence. He's talking about that ignorance, the first link that when you are operating moment by moment through that lens of blindness, of ignorance, that then results in actions of body, speech, and mind, the second link. This is what causes suffering. So he's talking about those kinds of actions, those that you have to clearly see that way. So this occurs when we take action that is connected through using, as I mentioned earlier, either one or all of the five sense consciousnesses and or the mental consciousness, and then having what dependently arises for you moment by moment um, arise on the basis of a mistaken way of experiencing how we think either ourselves, if that's the object, some thought possibly, or something external. Whatever the dependent arising is moment by moment, it's mistaken. So that's what causes suffering existence. So this is what it is. So if we can stop this specific kind of mistake or ignorance, the actions or act can also be stopped. So this is what leads one to even have the possibility to become wise and not continue to be an agent of creating karmic formations in an ignorant way. And the way to become wise is really what we need to discover. And that is a hint of that is given here. Nagarjuna literally tells us the reason why someone can be wise and therefore not be an agent of action, karmic formations. And he uses the word insight. So we need to understand how do we gain that insight? If we're interested in no longer creating suffering existence for ourselves and others, if Nagarjuna's right, how do we do that? So here we move to the answer. Again, quoting Nagarjuna from his treatise on the middle way, he says, with the cessation of ignorance, action will not arise. That's what I was just dancing through using way too many words. And he says it in one sentence of a verse. With the cessation of ignorance, action will not arise. The cessation of ignorance occurs through meditation and wisdom. So now he's tipping us into what did he mean by insight? So we have to say here that since all actions happen through this lens of ignorance, the antidote has to be if we could cut that off, if we could end the way we mistakenly or ignorantly experience all things, then actions will not arise. This is the key. So we have to go back to looking at ignorance, and that is then we need to start to ask ourselves, well, what exactly, if he says that it occurs, this cessation, this ending of ignorance occurs through meditation and wisdom, what are they specifically? What are they? I mean, everybody meditates nowadays. So what is he talking about? Insight meditation, mindfulness meditation? We need to discover that. And what does he mean by wisdom? There's all kinds of wisdom. There's scientific wisdom. There's wisdom of philosophers. There's all kinds of wisdom. There's a wisdom of a mother. There's all kinds of wisdom. We need to discover exactly what that is. So here, wisdom. Nagarjuna tells us that in order to really modify our actions and our propensities, that potential karmic ripenings, as I call them, we need wisdom. In this context, wisdom means understanding the real nature of things, the true nature of things. And in Buddhism, we call that kind of wisdom the wisdom of emptiness. So here we're zeroing in on what it is that we need to become adept at, understanding something very, very specific, emptiness. That is the antidote to stop karmic formations, the antidote to stopping suffering existence. As Nagarjuna says, the cessation of ignorance. With that, actions will not arise. So this is the prescription. So we really need to take seriously the topic of understanding how karma formations cause suffering existence, where that comes from, ignorance, and how the antidote to that is a specific wisdom, a wisdom of emptiness. So then this is the next point that we are zeroing in on here so that we have our framework really, really clear in our mind as we delve into why are we spending time learning about emptiness. It's not just a cool topic. Um, so um, here, um, I'll say that as we constantly conceive of dependently arising moment by moment, everything that we conceive and experience, we do it, as we've been talking about, by either becoming attached or having aversion to all things. But what is the nature of that attachment? What actually is fundamentally present there? Fundamentally, what's present in our mind is believing and experiencing and seeing through and the rest of our sense consciousnesses and our mental consciousness that everything has inherent self-existence. We experience everything as having a fixed, permanent, never-changing nature. Even for many of us who know about emptiness and know about what inherent existence is, and maybe even have done meditations on emptiness, um, when we're not thinking about, reflecting, contemplating, all the way up to doing meditative equipoise on emptiness, we're constantly experiencing everything as inherently existence, even if we intellectually understand that they're not. So intellectually understanding that they're not is really just the beginning of practicing emptiness. And then this is what is meant in this verse, going back, the cessation of ignorance occurs through meditation and wisdom. So we now know what type of wisdom we're focused on in terms of trying to gain that wisdom. But the only way to really have that occur beyond an intellectual understanding is through meditation, specific meditation. So we do so, meaning gain that wisdom by learning very specific types of meditations that analyze the object, whatever is dependently arising in our mind in meditation. We're analyzing that object, looking for, trying to find, searching for a very specific quality. It is nothing more than looking to see if it has inherent existence. Is it fixed? Is it permanent? Does it stand on its own? Does it not dependently arise? Does it inherently exist? Independently exist? Stand on its own? And then this is also known as the object of negation. So in these kind of meditations that we're going to be delving into throughout the rest of this course, that's all we are looking for. Nothing else. We're not negating anything. It's not even possible in this kind of meditation to negate anything else unless you're doing the emptiness meditation incorrectly, which many people do. So it's important to know this up front. And then the type of meditations we do are commonly known by many phrases, but one that is very common is that we're using analytical reasoning of the ultimate nature of the specific object. We're not looking, most of us know that in Buddhist cosmology, everything has what's called an ultimate nature and a conventional nature. We're not looking for anything that has to do with conventional nature. As a matter of fact, by focusing in on ultimate nature of an object, specifically looking for inherent existence, it reinforces and gives us clarity about the true nature of conventional existence, which is very interesting. We'll discover that as we move along. So this is really important to understand when Nagarjuna talks about cessation of ignorance can only happen through meditation and wisdom. Then here we're starting to put a little bit of detail, a lot of detail in terms of what exactly he's talking about in that regard. So specifically, then, just to say a few more words about this verse and about these two, and more specifically about meditation. Um, these types of meditations, and I say plural because there's a number of them, um, they act as an instrument that our mind can actually use. It's like having a very, very powerful microscope. We can look very closely at the ultimate nature of an object and specifically determine if that object has any fixed, permanent, never changing, inherent, existent nature. Can we find it? That's all we're doing in emptiness meditation. Can we find it? That's the $1 million question. And then after we learn how to do this specific type of meditation, this meditative search, I should say, we have to really go at it. Well, what do I mean by that? Go at it means that we have to apply the process of using these various specific meditations to various objects. Classically, Chandrakirti's sevenfold reasoning that I mentioned is one of the meditations. Let's move on to what just put on the screen here so we can recall the ones we're going to be using. That first one classically uses, because at the time Chandrakirti lived, it used a chariot as a way to analyze if a self exists. So we're going to be exploring that meditation, but we're going to be doing it using a car. Because most of us know a car is more a modern version of a vehicle that used to be used, such as a chariot. So we're not going to be using a chariot. So we apply it, and we'll be applying this very hands-on in throughout this series, to a car, to self, to the I, to the me, to the my, to all appearing phenomena again and again. We won't be doing it during the sessions, but learning them, we can apply them again and again, repeatedly, repeatedly, to see if we could find that inherent existent nature. Again, can it be found? I like to think of it like when my kids were growing up, we used to have a series of books that were published, and the object of each one of these incredibly elaborate page spreads was to find a character called Waldo. So it was like looking for Waldo. You had to find him. So, of course, in those books, you could find Waldo. Here, maybe we can't find inherent existent nature for the object we're looking at. So that leads me to say that when the object can't be found, and we're talking about what? The object of negation. This object. What is that object? Inherent existence. Then we begin the process of how to stop actions, like Nagarjuna said, meaning karmic formations. That directly changes the way we act physically, verbally, and mentally, the way we perceive, think, and act, and thereby change what we see and the consequences of our actions. So here, Nagarjuna used the word meditation because he's underscoring for us that you can't just go to a class and learn about emptiness or read a book. That's like just the beginning. You then have to spend time doing deep reflection on emptiness in the form of these meditations, these reasonings. But then, more importantly, you have to internalize them. There's only one way to internalize them, and that's to do meditation, these specific meditations. And when one does them well, what manifests is this, this wisdom, this specific wisdom. It happens, it manifests. That's the only way, folks. So it's a difficult, challenging, complicated subject, but the subject has to be tackled this way. The prescription is been given to us by Nagarjuna. So this is how our mind stream, our actual mind stream, is changed, and our experience becomes not merely like a philosophical theory, but one that we can reason our way um, into, and then basically have it take up the way that we actually change, the way we actually live in the world and we live our life. This goes to the opening point I made about how could we utilize this sort of what could be considered abstract reality of thinking about, so what if something has inherent existence or not? Once one does these meditative practices, it makes those changes that I just alluded to. So it's a very profound series of meditation practices that open up the door to first loosening those links, the chains of the 12 links of dependent origination. And then really, eventually, what happens is that if you practice these meditations based on a clear understanding through study, uh, and following meditative instructions and doing the meditations well, and doing them repeatedly, like I said, that they eventually start, and this is an experience, it's not an intellectual process. Your, which you may not even be aware of in your ordinary experience of moment by moment reality, because in actuality, you've been experiencing things this way since beginningless time. That sense of inherent existence of objects that are you're arising with dependently. And even if you're not consciously thinking, oh yeah, that's inherently existent, what that is starts to get really shaky. It gets very, very shaky. And you're starting to put the initial cracks in that foundation called ignorance. And that's at the same time, that's when wisdom of emptiness like blossoms in its place. You have to create the space for it to blossom. Meditation, these specific kind of meditations are the vehicle. They're the prescription that the doctor ordered. The doctors here being the Buddha, Chandrakirti, Nagarjuna, etc. So, um, it's pretty exciting stuff from my point of view. Um, so again, once this is experientially occurring for us, the way I just sort of fumbled my way through trying to give you a sense of how it happens, if it actually transpires, um, it puts those cracks in that foundation, like I said, but then that starts to have you experientially, as well as intellectually, conceptually, start to suspect that emptiness of all phenomena and self, actually might be the case. And that there isn't anything that inherently self exists, and that it is a real possibility. And when that occurs, if you could keep the framework in mind of the Four Noble Truths, how that manifests and takes place and is articulated, especially the first and second noble truths in the wheel of life, especially in the 12 links of dependent origination, if you can keep that in mind, and then you see that you might be able to change the status of what's dependently arising in your mind through a mistaken way of experiencing things, that things don't inherently exist, then you owe it to yourself and all others who are also suffering. Make it your job to earnestly, to continuously refine and perfect your experience in meditation of negating the object of meditation, of the ultimate nature of how things really exist, and allowing in a full form to take presence in your mind stream, that absence of inherent existence, that absence of inherent existence, as you can clearly hold it with meditative concentration and just reside with it, is simply the absence of inherent existence. There is no other object, image, conceptual idea, thought, positive um, uh, conceptual arising that takes the place of inherent existence, the lack of inherent existence. Emptiness is simply the absence of that. It's called a non-affirming negative. So this is really important. To get to that point, you have to repeat it. It's your job to repeatedly take on meditation on emptiness. And through that, then this arising occurs. And then when that happens, when you get the very strong experience of that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many others identify that for us as practitioners as having developed what's called inferential understanding of emptiness, experience of emptiness. It's inferential only because we're still not seeing emptiness directly. We still have an what's commonly referred to as an image in our consciousness, our mental consciousness also intertwined with our sense consciousnesses. And then this brings about, especially when we're not focused on doing one of these meditations on emptiness, that falling back into experiencing things as if they inherently exist. But more and more, as we move along, we come to an understanding that we know that they don't exist that way. And what that does is that changes. That changes the way, as I alluded to earlier, the way we think, perceive, experience, loosen up, holding on to things, ordinary things that arise moment by moment. This is a direct antidote not only to ignorance, but attachment and aversion, and having the presence of non-virtuous activities being even possible any longer. At the very least, we feel more inclined to do virtuous activities, especially having correct view of reality, because that's what we're talking about developing here. So, and that's a real energetic engine. So, there's nothing more important you could be doing with your free time. So we have to work, we have to take care of our family, etc. But this is really amazing stuff. If you could end suffering, that's pretty amazing. And it can start to happen at this point. So all the way back to Nagarjuna's verse, this is what he means by becoming wise. Here, once we develop inferential emptiness, start to become a little bit wise and we start to develop some insight. So then we can start to move towards being no longer an agent of action. It's not just a cool thought. It's something you can transform yourself into being wise and filled with insight, the insight being the wisdom of emptiness through the vehicle of these kinds of specific meditations. And then we can end the three thorough afflictions. So, almost done. So, Nagarjuna, in another text called Precious Garland, introduces us here. So, I'm trying to move us along a little bit to some of the key objects that we will use in our investigation in these types of meditations and how the 12 links of dependent arising in these three groups, these three thorough afflictions mentioned earlier and again here, ignorance, action, and production of suffering, are where the problem all starts. So this verse, as long as the aggregates are conceived, right there, we have identified one of the objects we're going to be working with in these meditations. They're called the aggregates. As long as the aggregates are conceived. So we're going to be working with them in the sense of learning, unlearning how to conceive them correctly, not mistakenly. But here conceived means inherently self-existing. So again, context matters. So long thereby does the conception of I exist. So he's connecting here the idea of us saying, having this idea of I being connected to the aggregates. So in the next class, we'll be talking specifically about these objects. What are the aggregates? Many of you probably know what they are, but in this context, how do we utilize them in some of these meditations to investigate the existence as self and inherently self-existent I? So when he says I, so long thereby does the conception of I exist, he's talking about the mistaken conception of thinking that the I inherently exists, permanently is fixed. You do not exist in that way. That's a little scary, maybe, to think that way, but it doesn't mean that you don't exist, which we'll explore very clearly and thoroughly. And then the rest of the verse, which I should just finish reading. Further, when the conception of I exists, there is action from which, and from it, there also is birth. So he's talking about That action being what? Karmic formations, built on the mistaken concept of I existing, not existing meaning either nihilistically or in an absolute sense, but in the what's called the middle way sense, without with lack of where we think it has inherent self-existence. So that's what the I means here. And the culprit is the way we experience the aggregates and the way we experience the self dependently arising in connection with them. So this will be one of the main things we focus on in terms of unveiling that wisdom that we can see and experience called emptiness. So then that's and so then this quote is coming directly again from the his treatise Nagarjuna's treatise on um, the middle way. Through the cessation of this and that will not be manifest. The entire mass of suffering indeed thereby completely ceases. What a bold statement. He's basically saying that if we could put an end to this and that, what does he mean by this and that? He means all phenomena, sentient beings, and all objects that exist in samsaric realms of existence. All this and that won't manifest if we could remove ignorance and therefore remove karmic formations. That's how the entire massive suffering can end. Because if we can end that, then it all ends. It does not just a little bit. It can start with reducing that. Like I said, you start to see a change and experience a change, but it's definitely the end game is to remove it all. So he's not fooling around. And the bold statement completely ceases. So this is really, really important to sort of auspiciously wrap up our first session here and hopefully inspire us to move in to coming back for the rest of the series. Um, because here we're talking about these meditative processes, these analysis that we're going to be putting forth in our practice, not only applying to ourselves, but to all phenomena. To all other sentient beings are included in phenomena in Buddhist cosmology. Nothing has the quality of inherent existence. Human existence and experience are totally governed by the 12 links of dependent origination. But there's a flip side to that. Since they are essentially dependent, they are essentially empty. Dependent arising is the other side of the coin, the same coin as emptiness, and hence are impermanent. All things, all phenomena, including are impermanent and subject to change. Because we can change, this is possible, what we're talking about. Doing meditations on the nature of emptiness and affecting a change in our mind stream. Because we are not fixed, because we do not have inherent, fixed, permanent, unchanging self. That would mean anybody would try to effectively change towards virtue away from non-virtue would be impossible. It would be absolutely impossible. So the 12 links that we discussed tonight provide an anatomy of suffering. That's one way to look at it. But by understanding their impermanence and dependency, how everything they all dependently arise, we also can see what I call the cure for the condition. Again, going back to the prescription that the doctor here, being the Dharma doctor, is offering up. And the Dharma doctor here that we focused on tonight, paying a visit to, is Nagarjuna. So we cultivate a clear. Our job in this series is to cultivate the rest of the series, a clear and accurate view of the nature of all things, and that the view is explicitly one that is not only presented by Nagarjuna, but we clearly can lean into if we're Buddhist practitioners, um, taking refuge in the three jewels, because this comes directly from the Buddha in the form of Dharma. And that by internalizing it, remember how important that is. Internalizing this view that arises as we do these meditations. Um, and by taking up our experience of the world in accordance with that, that which arises and starts to loosen the grip of self-grasping on us, we can get to a point where it ceases. What ceases? This and that ceases. Grasping, which binds us to suffering. So, Nagarjuna's argument that is that we can achieve that. If we can achieve that, that is in Buddhism what we call reaching a state of liberation, ending suffering. Nirvana is the word that we also use. So here, though, I'll underscore that we're not just talking about our nirvana that kind of allows us to escape from this from existence, but rather engage with existence, with the world, in an enlightened and awakened way. This is true happiness. This is true ending of suffering. Um, and that's what liberation is. So that's kind of concludes what I wanted to talk about tonight. Do the framing out, do the present the prescription of what we're actually trying to do here. And I think that it's worth coming back. It will be fun at the beginning of the next session because we're going to be talking about one of the big elephants in the room when somebody really starts wrestling with and engaging with emptiness and karma. If we normally experience karma, all sentient beings experience karma. That's the engine that drives samsara. If nothing inherently exists on its own, then who and what actually carries karmic seeds? So this is a big tripwire for a lot of people, including Buddhists. There are various schools of Buddhism that engage in trying to describe emptiness in the context of there still being something that inherently exists. And we're going to walk through all those at the beginning of the next session, including the way that our school, the school that we're part of, by the way, is Prasangika Mahayamika, the Galupa tradition, then which doesn't subscribe to that. You cannot move a master like Nagarjuna off of like there is nothing that has inherent self-existence. Nothing. The Buddha, the path, the um, the becoming enlightened, ending suffering existence, etc. So it will be fun because maybe we'll have some discussion about that because it's really important to do that. Um, we're towards the end of the session. I apologize for talking for so long, but I did want to frame everything out. I'd like to know if people have any questions. So one question on the chat, and then I'll get to the question for Elijah. Was when I think when I just said nothing inherently self-exists, and then the question was not even space. So we'll talk about space next time, but space is something that is a a concept that we can relate to, that we can make an analogy to emptiness. It actually has nothing to do with emptiness space. So this is something we'll put under the microscope and clarify very, very, very clearly. So, um, so a few other questions. Elijah, I think you had a question, or maybe not. I'm not sure.
Uh,
I saw your hand raised, and then we'll get to Linda. Go ahead.
yes, thank you so much. This was very helpful.
Oh, good.
I'm firstly wondering because it's said by, like Nagarjuna, and you were saying like kind of once you realize emptiness, then the karma that you produce from not realizing emptiness is not it's not produced anymore. So thereby it's cutting off the future suffering we create. But what about all the karma we've already created in the past? Don't we still have to experience that?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we talk about the path, there is the path. If you're familiar with the five paths that make up the entirety of the path, the Buddhist path, the path of accumulation has to do with accumulating merit and the path of preparation. And then the third path is the path of seeing. Seeing what? It specifically is seeing emptiness directly. So until one reaches, and that can only be experienced in a very, very deep state of meditative equipoise with lots of qualifiers. I'm not going to go into those right now. And it's at that point, one cuts off at the root karma. You can no longer experience karma. But when you come out of that meditative equipoise and you come back to your ordinary consciousness, you experience everything the same because you haven't finished karma that's already taken place. So you kind of answered your own, not that you answered your own question, but your question about like, don't you have to? Yes, you do. And even as you become someone reaches a path of seeing emptiness directly, because you cut off karmic formations, you are no longer an ordinary being. This is what qualifies you as being what's called an Arya. And at that point, you've reached what's called the first bodhisattva ground. But then you still have to go through another path called the path of meditative habituation. Well, why? Because you're going through 10 what are called bodhisattva bhumis that within the context of doing practice there, you are finishing off all previous karma that has actualized, meaning become karmic formations that then have to ripen. The quality of how they ripen, the severity of how they ripen, there's all kinds of factors we could talk about in terms of being altered by your practice and by being at that level of the path. And it's fairly extraordinary. And you read about the bodhisattva bhumis and the characteristics of them and what you're capable of, etc. Very advanced practice. But you are right. You still have further to go. So reaching the path of seeing is considered liberation. But liberation isn't complete enlightenment. You still have to go through the fourth path, meditative habituation, and then the fifth path is the path of no more learning, which is actually Buddhahood or enlightenment. That's different than liberation or nirvana. So these are things we can talk about at another time, but hopefully that answers your question, Elijah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Linda, did you have a question?
I can wait if we don't have time.
No, no, go ahead.
Okay.
Unless Chappelle like decides he's going to cut us off.
Absolutely not. I'd
Okay.
like for it to proceed.
Okay, go ahead, Linda.
I hope this isn't too iconoclastic, but I really wonder about this. And who am I to question the Buddha? But the actions that precede thought, cognition, are actually emotions from a cognitive science perspective. So the specific action is the default decision about whether or not sensory perceptions, once you coalesce them, are safe or unsafe. And, in terms of our physiology, the amygdala coalesces things and their response precedes every single action thereafter. And that is, in neuroscience terms, cognition or thinking. So anyway, the Wheel of Life talks about actions preceding thought, and I'm wondering if maybe they're talking about emotions or feelings, because it seems like with insight meditation, um, leading to wisdom, emptiness, all that good stuff, we have to override our default response, um, which is the primary concern about survival, which is why the amygdala does what it does and makes us feel separate and makes us feel like there's an I and makes there feel like this and that when we actually are all one. So we certainly catch glimpses of emptiness with meditation that we amplify, hopefully. So are the actions that start this whole cycle maybe more accurately conceptualized as those emotions talking about safe versus unsafe, which result in safe separation and, of course, cause us to act like jerks or unselfish, unskillfully?
Yeah.
From a
Yeah. Well,
scientific perspective, actions are derived from the emotion safe, unsafe. So, would
yeah.
the authors talk about that?
Yeah, it's a lot to talk about because we have to go into dissecting a little bit more forensically the flow of the 12 links of dependent origination. But when we talk about the second link, um, which more accurately is called for karmic formation,
Not
it,
actions. Okay.
right, um, resulting in actions, then we're talking about the process that there, and we can talk about this maybe next time, right at the beginning of the session. There is criteria when we talk about the laws of karma, and we talk about how does a karmic um, seed, a klesha, actually become complete, meaning be planted in a mind stream. Then there's a criteria, and then that's all represented in the 12 links of dependent origination by the potter. That's why we use a potter who's in the process of forming these karmas. And then there are two parts actually which we didn't get into, of the third link, which have to do with the causal um, conception occurring and then the resultant consciousness occurring. So there is a whole bunch of stuff that goes on that does precede actual action as we know it.
Yes.
And we need to talk about the difference between those things. So um, when we talk about acts and actions from Nagarjuna's point of view, he's really taught. That's why I parenthetically or in brackets talked about karmic formations in the way that I'm, again, very quickly trying to paint a picture that it's not exactly the way we think of actions in the way you're describing, which is totally accurate, of course. It's scientific and neurologically sound and makes sense from a human evolutionary point of view as well. Um, but there's a lot more that could be said about that. But because we don't have that much time, I'll just lead us into having further discussion about that. And when we begin our next session, is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just see before we hang up if there are any other questions. Um, okay. Yeah, it's just a few people actually saying they had to hop off because because I went too long. So I will uh, stop the sharing and I think we can end the recording if you'd like to do that.